welcome back to my channel. My name's Rachel and this is Stitched Up. So today's video is going to be a review of the Paper Theory Zadie jumpsuit. Now, I didn't actually think I was going to review this jumpsuit, so I thought that I'd come on here today and talk you through my thoughts about this pattern. Now, as you know, I always give my honest opinions about sewing patterns and fabrics, etc. That's just what I do. I'm never swayed by what's cool in the sewing community or what's really hot right now in fashion or anything like that. And this pattern came out probably about 2 or 3 years ago now, I think. And I'm going to be honest with you, when this pattern came out, everybody was jumping on the Zadie jumpsuit bandwagon, and it was an incredibly popular pattern. Loads of people were making it, and usually when that happens, it's one of the things that puts me off a pattern, and I'm going to explain why. When I started sewing, one of the reasons I started sewing was to be able to make my own outfits, my own garments, my own clothes, and put my own tweak on things and make things that were unique to me. And that's one of the things that I love about sewing, the fact that, you know, you can make something and you know that nobody else has the same clothing as you. And one of the things that I guess puts me off when something becomes really, really popular is that everybody is making it and everybody is wearing it. And when that happens, I don't want to make it, because that's not why I started sewing. And yeah, I never get swayed by popularity or anything like that. And usually I'm always just very late to the party, which is exactly what's happened with this. So one of the other things that put me off with this jumpsuit pattern as well was that a lot of the versions that I've seen are very, very, very oversized. Now, this is an oversized pattern and it's designed to be easy to sew and easy to fit, and that's fantastic because it means those of you that are relatively new to sewing, have never made a jumpsuit before, something like this is going to be perfect for you, because it's just going to teach you new techniques without being really difficult to fit. However, I felt that some of the versions that I've seen really give me American convict vibes. You know, the American prisoners that dress in the orange jumpsuits, it's all I could see with this pattern, and the oversized nature of it really put me off. But slowly over the last couple of years, I have actually come round to having a go at this pattern, and I decided this month, with this month being trouser month for me, that it was the right time to have a go at it. So here we are. Right, I am going to talk you through my thoughts about the pattern, about the instructions, about the drafting, etc, etc, and I made some notes as well so that I don't forget anything. But first things first, I'm just going to change my battery because it's flashing at me. Right, I'm back. Okay, so the Zadie jumpsuit is a UK pattern and it comes in sizes 6 to 20. They are UK sizes. So what that equates to is a body measurement of 31.5 inches up to 45-inch bust, a waist measurement of 24 up to 37.5. Excuse me for looking down, but I need to look at my notes. And hip measurement of 34 to 47.5. Now, those of you that fall outside those size ranges will probably think that this jumpsuit is not for you and not very inclusive. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this vlog, it is very, very oversized, and the finished garment measurements range from a 37-inch bust up to a 50.5-inch bust, 31-inch up to 44.5-inch waist, and 42 to a 55.5-inch hip. So already you can see that there is a lot of ease built into this jumpsuit. Now, I measured up based on the body measurements between a size 10 and a 12. However, when I looked at the finished garment measurements, it incorporates about 6.5 to 7.5 inches of ease from the bust through to the hip. And I just did not want that amount of ease in my finished jumpsuit, because I just felt that it would just be too big and baggy and look like I was wearing a sack, if I'm perfectly honest. So I decided to size down and I went with the size 8. Now, that's worked out really well because it means that I've still got enough ease in this jumpsuit for me. I think that worked out between sort of an inch to, well, more than an inch, about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of ease throughout, which has worked perfectly. I've got enough room in here to move. It's not really closely fitted, but it's not also massively oversized that it just hangs off me either. And looking through some of the sewing community's opinions of this jumpsuit, I think there's been a few comments made about the crotch depth of this jumpsuit as well, which I will come to a little bit later on in my review. This pattern is drafted for a height of 5'7" and also for a C cup. Now, I'm a B cup, but it does say in the instructions that the tester garments varied between an A cup through to a double D and didn't need to make any adjustments to the bodice whatsoever. So if you fall into sort of that cup range, then you'll probably find that it's absolutely fine. As I say, I'm a B cup and it's fine. It's absolutely fine for me. This jumpsuit comes in 2 versions. You can make the short sleeve version, which is the one that I'm wearing, or you can add in a sleeve as well, which takes it to a sort of 3/4 length sleeve. It's designed with no fastenings apart from ties, so there's no buttons or buttonholes to contend with, no zippers either. So it's a wrap bodice, as you will see from some of the pictures that I will insert throughout the vlog, and because of that, it just makes it really easy to fit, and there's not sort of too many techniques that are going to test you if you're a bit more inexperienced in this kind of sewing. Now, there are 7 pattern pieces to this jumpsuit if you're making the short sleeved version like I'm wearing. If you're making the sleeved version, obviously there is an extra pattern piece in that as well, but it is actually a really quick sew. Well, you know, you all know that I sew these things up really quick anyway, but I would say it's, you know, there's nothing too taxing for you at all. I think the most difficult part of sewing this jumpsuit is 2 things. One, attaching the bias binding to the neckline. This neckline, I'm going to insert some pictures to show you how it looks close up, but it is bias bound all the way around. There's no facings at all, but if you've never attached bias binding to a neckline so that it's on view like this is, then it is a bit of a technique and a bit of a skill to get the top stitching really, really neat and tidy. And the other slightly tricky part as well is making the tie belt. Now, there's 2 ways you can make a tie belt dependent on the type of fabric that you're using, and also, I guess, your own personal preference as well. You can either do the loop method, which is you sew the belt right sides together and you turn it out. Or you can do it a bit like bias binding, where you fold in the raw edges on the long-sided edge of the tie belt and then fold them again together and then stitch together that way. If you're using heavier weight fabrics, I would suggest you do it that way, because trying to turn out heavyweight fabrics is actually quite awkward. And one of the parts of the instructions that I do think is probably not going to give you the best finish is the way it tells you to construct the belt. Instead of, the belt comes in 2 pieces, and you leave one edge raw, which is attached to the raw edge of the bodice before you attach the bias binding. However, it doesn't tell you to stitch up the short end of the other end of the tie belt. It tells you to turn it out first and then fold in the open edge of one of your short ends and then stitch it closed. I don't think that gives you a really great finish. And so what I did was, when I constructed my tie belt and I stitched it right sides together, I sewed up all along the long edge and up the shorter end of one end as well. And then what I do is I use a chopstick and I fold over the sewn up end of the tie belt and then basically unroll it down my chopstick, and then it just means you've got a really neat finish. It is a bit awkward to do on heavier weight fabrics. This is a medium weight linen that I've used for this jumpsuit, and it was a little bit awkward. So anything heavier than this, say for instance if you use denim, I would suggest that you use the bias method of constructing your tie belt rather than doing it right sides together and trying to turn it the right way out. You will find that just almost impossible with denim. But otherwise, the fabric suggestions for this pattern are sort of the medium weight woven fabrics. So you're looking at things like cottons, linens, as I've mentioned, you could use chambrays or lightweight denims. You could, I guess, use a heavier weight denim as well, but it would mean that the bodice would be a bit more structured. The pattern also mentions that you can use fabrics such as viscose twill and crepes as well. That will give you much more of a fluid, drapey effect to the jumpsuit, so it won't be quite as structured as what you see on the version that I'm wearing now. And it also mentions that you can use jersey fabrics as well. So it doesn't mention anything about sizing down, which is something that I would bear in mind if you are using knit fabrics. Obviously, you wouldn't want it completely close fitting if you were using a knit fabric, but I would bear in mind the stretch of the fabric that you're using. And if you are going to use a knit fabric, I would steer away from things like viscose jerseys, because I think that's going to be too lightweight, and you're going to want to go for something a bit more heavyweight, sort of like your double knits, your pontes, that kind of thing, I would say. Will just give you, it'd be a little bit easier to sew, and it's just going to hold the pattern design a little bit better. It does mention that if you are using knit fabrics, you need to be really careful about the bias binding, because it's going to be very, very easy to stretch that neckline out and get a really wavy finish to this neckline, which is what you don't want. So alterations wise, the only alteration I made to this pattern was to lengthen the bodice by 1 inch, and that works really well for me. Within the fabric suggestions, it recommends that you need, I mean, obviously it depends on the size that you're making and the version that you're making, but for the short sleeved version that I lengthened by 1 inch, I needed to use almost 3 meters of fabric for this, and the instructions say that I would need, based on the size that I made, about 2.3 meters. Now, looking at the pattern layout and how I cut my pattern out, I didn't really alter from the suggested pattern layout in the instructions. But I would say that the reason why I ended up needing to use more fabric than the pattern instructions tell you to use was mainly the bias strip, because obviously the bias strip has to be cut on the bias, and if I didn't need to cut the bias strip out of the same fabric, then I think I would have got away with at the most 2.5 meters. But unfortunately, I needed that amount of fabric, so I would just bear that in mind as well if you are going to make this pattern. The other thing to bear in mind as well is this pattern comes with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So you don't have a lot of leeway there with your seam allowance. It's not the standard 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimetres that we generally see. And I'm unsure why Paper Theory have decided to go with 1 centimetre. Doesn't really say in the instructions. It's not that important. As I say, there's a lot of ease in this pattern, so it's just if you are going to need to adjust it slightly, you just need to bear in mind that you've not probably got a lot to play with there in that seam allowance, and just make sure that you do read the instructions carefully, and don't go steaming ahead thinking you've got 5/8 of an inch, because you haven't. The other interesting thing about the instructions is the point that she makes when it comes to the neckline before you attach the bias binding. She mentions about stay stitching the neckline, and the reason for that is to make sure that you don't stretch out the fabric when you're attaching the bias binding. And she puts something in the instructions like, don't miss out this step because you'll pay for it later, which made me chuckle a little bit. But I think it would be, this is aimed at more of a beginner, and I think it would be probably useful just to highlight that a little bit more about the benefits of stay stitching and what could happen if you don't do it. If I was reading that as a beginner, I would think, what does she mean by I'll pay for it later if I don't do it? And yeah, so I think if you should just explain that a little bit more, I think that would be really helpful for beginners. But essentially, stay stitching is just running a line of stitching within the seam allowance all the way around the bias cut of your bodice. So that means this, when you cut your bodice out and you attach and you sew your shoulder seams together, the front edge here is on the bias, and also the neckline is curved, so parts of that are on the bias as well. And what that means is the more you handle it, the more likely you are to stretch that fabric quite easily. And with a wrap bodice like this, you want it to fit very nicely into the back of your neck, and you don't want any gaping around the front neckline as well. And it's very easy to do that, especially when you're a beginner. I made loads of errors when I was a beginner with these kind of necklines. I would have necklines hanging off the back of my neck out here, and loads of sort of wavy edges here and gaping and whatnot. And quite often it's just from over handling the fabric on these edges that are more curved or on the diagonal. And so yeah, stay stitching, when you run that line of stitches, as soon as you've cut the pattern pieces out, it just means that it holds the fabric taut, so that when you come to manipulating the fabric, when you are attaching the bias binding, you're not going to stretch it out of shape. So yeah, so I do think that it would be helpful just to explain that a little bit more in the instructions, but otherwise the instructions are really clear. There are really good diagrams in the instructions. I don't really have any preference between diagrams or photos in instructions. All I would say is when designers use photographs, I wish they would use very clear photographs. I can think of quite a few pattern instructions for garments that I've made in the past where the photographs have either used a really busy fabric or a really dark coloured fabric that's not easy to see the steps that it's asking you to make. And it's fine for sort of when you've been sewing a while and you're used to putting things together, most steps are easy to do, but those sort of tricky steps that are a little bit more involved or a little bit more awkward to understand from text alone, I think, you know, photographs are sometimes a bit more difficult to really show that step and how that step works and how things come together. So I do like line drawings in those instances, and yeah, this pattern is great for that. These instructions have line drawings, they're very, very clear, and you know, that I've got no complaints there at all. Finishing the seams inside, the instructions recommend that you overlock all the seams inside, which is what I did for this pattern. I've used a medium weight fabric. Now you can use French seams on the majority of steps if you wanted to do French seams, if you wanted much more of a neat finish inside. I chose not to do that using this fabric because it's quite heavyweight and I just felt that it would make the seams too bulky. But if you were using a more lighter weight cotton, for instance, and you don't like overlocking or you don't have an overlocker, you can either use zigzag seam on the inside to make sure that your fabric doesn't fray, or you can obviously do French seams as well. If you're using knit fabric, you don't need to finish them at all because the majority of knit fabrics don't unravel. So the other points to tell you about this pattern are that it does have pleats in the bodice and in the front and the front of the trousers, which obviously the pleats in the bodice give you a little bit of bust shaping. It also has a couple of pleats in the back bodice and the back of the trousers as well, and it has lovely slant pockets in the sides as well. I really like slant pockets and I much prefer them to inseam side pockets. I just think they are much more flattering and they tend to sit against your body better as well than inseam pockets do. So it has a little gap in the side of the bodice here where the tie belt feeds through, and then obviously it just wraps around you, and you can tie it however you want. You can tie it at the front like I've done, or I guess you could tie it at the side or at the back, and yeah, that's the only fastening. The front of the bodice does wrap in front as well, as you can see there. I can get my hand all the way in, and the bias binding attaches all the way around the neckline, all the way around the front bodice, and then pivots around this edge here and comes down right into the crotch seam. And the instructions on how to finish that in the crotch seam are actually really good and really clear, and it gives you a nice neat finish on the inside. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video that one of the issues that lots of people have found is the length of the crotch depth, and certainly when you look at the back trouser piece of this pattern, the crotch depth is huge. And I think many people have found that because of the depth in the crotch in this pattern, that it just hangs too low. Now, what I would say is that you do need a bit of extra length in that crotch depth to be able to get this jumpsuit on and off. So that's one thing to bear in mind. But I'm quite long bodied, and I usually in trousers and definitely in jumpsuits will have to lengthen the crotch in the trouser part of the pattern anyway. But based on feedback from other people that have made this pattern, I decided not to bother, and certainly when I looked at the pattern piece, I thought I would just leave the crotch depth as it was because I thought there would be plenty of room, and there really is plenty of room. It doesn't hang too low on me, but again, I'm tall and long bodied, so that's just another thing to bear in mind, that you may need to adjust that if you are shorter. So all in all, I would say, yeah, it's a great pattern. I really like it. I'm so glad that I decided to size down. I was worried when I was sewing this up that it might not fit me, but I really didn't have anything to worry about. There's plenty of ease in this pattern. It's going to be great for summer. I can't wait for summer. I can't wait for some nice weather in the UK. We've had such a cold winter here, and yeah, it's going to be great for, you know, just wearing in summer. As I say, the fabric that I have chosen to make this version out of is a lovely bio washed linen in the rust colourway by Higgs and Higgs. I will leave a link to that down below. They've got it in loads of colours, and I'd love to make a navy version and possibly a black version as well. The legs are just above ankle length, and I just made it up as the pattern instructed, but if you don't like that length, you could lengthen it. You know, if you wanted to make them full length, it's easy enough to do just by lengthening the leg, or you could even, you know, chop the legs off altogether and make shorts, so you make it into like a little play suit, which I think would be quite nice for spring and summer. There's lots of options that you could do. I also think it would be really nice to make sort of like a turn-up cuff on the short sleeve version here. I think that would be really nice as an extra little hack as well, so that's something that I might try and make a short play suit version with a little cuff on the sleeves there. One of the issues that I had was matching up the pleats on the bodice to the trousers. I'm going to just insert a little bit of footage here to show you what I mean, and I couldn't figure out where I went wrong with this, because as you can see in this little bit of footage, one side matches up and then the other side doesn't. So I honestly don't know what I did or where I went wrong, and I had already overlocked all the waistband seam when I noticed that I'd done that, but you know, when I've got it on like this, you can't actually tell, so I've decided just to leave it, and you know, there was no way I was going to unpick all that and do that again. Is that lazy of me? Yeah, but so all in all, I hope you love my jumpsuit. I'm really pleased with it. I really like it. As I say, I am very late to the party. There's probably loads of reviews of this pattern on YouTube, and you know, I would encourage you to go and check those out and get other people's opinions of this jumpsuit and this pattern, because there'll be lots and lots of advice out there if you like this pattern or you've considered it but haven't been sure. I really like it. I'm glad that I waited, to be honest. As I say, when new patterns come out, sometimes I do immediately fall in love with something and want to make it straight away. Other times I like it but want to be a bit more reserved, and if everybody's making the same thing, I just don't want to make it. So I'm glad that I waited, and yeah, I really like it. I always think it's great as well to look at other people's reviews, to see it on different body shapes and different people and how they've interpreted the pattern, the different fabrics they've used. I think it's great to just get everybody's, you know, everybody's take on something. That's what makes this sew malarkey so good, isn't it? But I hope you've enjoyed my little review today of this pattern, and yeah, I'll be back with you really soon. Take care, bye.